Hi there and welcome to this video for IB Biology, the independent project, and this is booklet 3. And again, remember this video is part of this project. You should also be using the IB textbook and links in the project booklet to ensure you fully understand everything. If you don't understand anything, you must approach a teacher for help, and also this content absolutely will be assessed both in tests within school and also in the final examinations. So just because it's independent work, please do not overlook it in revision. So the first part we're going to look at today is biodiversity and species loss, and this will link to the field trip. It will also link to later work you will do on the species diversity index. So let's get into it and start by looking at biodiversity. So there are different types of biodiversity. Generally, biodiversity just means the range of living organisms in an ecosystem or within the biosphere, depending on what level you're looking at it. But if we're looking at it from levels of biodiversity, the first level is genetic biodiversity. And this is when we look at the range of genetic material within one species. So if you were to look at humans, for example, you would be looking at all the genetic variation in your classroom. That shows you that there's very great differences in genetic diversity. Now, genetic diversity is important, this range of genetic material, because it can create breeds, it can create different types of breeds of animals. Variation is important because obviously it makes us individual, but also if you think about it from a terms of survival technique, if there is variation, it allows you different adaptations and to survive different species to survive changes in conditions. So that makes it extremely important as a result. The next level is species biodiversity or diversity, and this is what we'll generally be focusing on the idea of in these videos. But species diversity is something you're going to study a bit more on the field trip and in class when you do something called Simpson's Diversity Index to measure it. And basically it's down to two things. So if you were to look at these two fields, you might say, well, if we've got species field A, and field B. And you might say, well, obviously field A has the highest biodiversity, which I would agree with. Okay, but with biodiversity in species level is based on two things. It's based on species richness, which is the number of different species found in a habitat. And what I'm going to say to you is that actually both of these fields have 20 species on there, even though you can only really see one dominant species on field B. It actually does have 20. So if you were just counting the number of different species, you would have to say they've got the same amount of biodiversity, and that's the species richness. But we don't take that into account only. Species diversity is species richness plus species evenness, and this is the degree at which each species is represented. So below you've got one same species richness, both got 20 species on each field, but species A has got, field A has got a much higher level of evenness. There's a lot more representation of all the different plants, whereas field B has got very low evenness, a poor representation, because you can see one dominant species there in the grass. And the last one is habitat biodiversity, and habitat biodiversity is the range of habitats where an organism might live. So in the UK we've got lots of different habitats like sand dunes, woodland, meadows, streams, mountains, all those different habitats which allow different types of biodiversity to survive. Now, obviously, there is an issue with biodiversity at the minute, and that is that we believe we're entering the 6th mass extinction. And you can see here lots of species are being evaluated for their extinction risks. 100% of bird species are currently facing potential extinctions, and you see the high numbers for lots and lots of types of different kingdoms of animals. Now, current extinction rate is about 1,000 times higher than what we would expect the background extinction rate. So the background extinction rate is what numbers we'd expect to go extinct if humans weren't here. But with human activity, it is estimated that 50% of the current species on the planet will be extinct by the end of this century. And as we've talked about in previous videos, the hotspots where most of the biodiversity is are particularly vulnerable. We've also mentioned before the main causes of these. So we're entering, we believe, something called the Holocene extinction, which is a human-caused mass extinction event. And this word anthropogenic means this is completely caused by humans. And obviously the dodo in the picture there is a symbol of human extinction because it's the first major bird species we've wiped out. So the anthropogenic causes, the human causes of extinction of our biodiversity is habitat destruction. So we are destroying massive amounts of habitat, either building cities, making farmland, those sort of things are causing issues. We are polluting the environment, which is obviously adding chemicals which the animals and plants can't cope with. And we are introducing invasive species into areas where they shouldn't be. So for example, when we went to the Galapagos Islands, we took goats with us, which have caused massive issues, wiping out all the local plant life. We are over-exploiting, which means we are taking all the resources for ourselves, and effectively we are out-competing other species as a result. And obviously the most modern one, which obviously does link to all the others, is global climate change. So we are changing the atmosphere, so the temperature of the planet is getting warmer, and you're seeing the effects of that, particularly now in this summer in 2023. So as a result, the number of endangered species is rising each year. And obviously these threats to biodiversity are having big impacts as a result. So what is the evidence of this? So you could be asked that question, and actually it's not a question you might necessarily think, oh well, this is the answer, but it is actually quite obvious when you sort of see the list. Well, the evidence of the biodiversity crisis is that we have a high rate of species population decline. So we can see the numbers of species dropping rapidly around the world. We can see that the range of species are declining, so they're not existing in as wider areas as they used to, and they're found in much smaller areas now as a result. The diversity of species within an ecosystem is declining. So if you study ecosystems, the diversity, the amount of different species, the species richness is starting to decrease. Or the evenness, I suppose, of both of them, in fact. There you go, perfect. So the richness and the evenness are both declining in ecosystems. The area of the ecosystem itself is declining, so there's less space where these species can be found, and there is a higher level of degradation of the habitat. So the habitats are getting poorer and poorer in quality as a result. And within species, we are even finding a loss of diversity. So just stuff like farming, for example, we're breeding particular plants which have particular traits that we want, and therefore the biodiversity of that species is being wiped out. Okay, so part 2 then is looking at, well, how do we do conservation of biodiversity? What can we do to support the stability of ecosystems and to conserve biodiversity? So biodiversity, as we've said before, is 60% of it is found in what we call hotspots, which you can see on this red map. Unfortunately, the hotspots are the areas generally where the biodiversity is being wiped out. So hotspots tend to be in the tropics, okay, and that is because there are very few limiting factors in the tropics. So the limiting factors we mean are stuff like sunlight and moisture. So remember what we did when we did biomes in the tropical rainforest. The tropical rainforests are there because there is high levels of temperature, but also high levels of precipitation, giving it the perfect conditions. In these areas, obviously, 70% of the habitat has already been lost, and these areas contain endemic species, which are ones that only exist in that location on the planet. So if the lemurs, for example, in Madagascar are made extinct, then they will be gone because they don't exist anywhere else on the planet. In terms of how much of the land of the Earth is, it's only about 2.3% of the land surface. They're small areas, so resources can easily be exploited, and that can cause massive issues. They're heavily populated nearby, so if you think about the Amazon rainforest, obviously parts of Brazil are extremely heavily populated. And then hotspots tend to focus on plants as identification, and that is because the plants are providing the food and the habitat for the animals that live there. So the plants are effectively more essential than the animals. So which species are going extinct? Well, some species are more susceptible to it, but particularly the hotspot species are, and this is due to the fact they're suffering habitat loss. They are endemic. Humans are using the areas more and more for resources, and in some cases it is actually just due to fear. So for example, tigers are hunted due to fear, and that therefore is causing a loss of biodiversity as a result. So then we want to conserve, but what is the best way to conserve? Well, there are two types of biodiversity conservation you can split it into. The first type is in situ conservation, and in situ means in the original place. Okay, it's carried out in areas of the wild, and it's used for large populations. Okay, and it is often less expensive to conserving if you conserve a high number of species for less sort of money, but it does require a large area. The opposite of that is ex situ conservation, which is when you take the organism out of the original place, such as a zoo, for example, or a laboratory or an aquarium. And obviously, if we want to do experiments, this will help us maintain conditions to do so, but it obviously is much more expensive. You need very precise conditions to be maintained. It doesn't require as much of an area, but you can't do as high numbers as a result. So one of the main examples of ex situ conservation is zoos, and obviously we can use them for captive breeding. So some people still question whether zoos have a place in the world, but actually obviously they can definitely have a place in the world, because they can increase education and awareness, and they can be used for fundraising to raise money then for hopefully preserving the original habitat of those species as well. You can remove animals or plants as well from danger if the ecosystem they naturally live in is in extreme danger, and it might be in some cases at zoos unfortunately the only place that these animals still exist. And they have had successful breeding programs. The golden lion tamarin, for example, has been very successfully bred and returned into the wild as well. The problem with zoos obviously is they can only have a limited number of species. They are expensive and they can be difficult to return animals to the wild. Rare plants that have been grown in botanical gardens have been reintroduced to the wild just to be dug up then by collectors because they're so expensive, and sometimes the natural habitat may actually be gone. So then what do you do with those animals where reintroduction is impossible in the wild? Another example is seed banks, and there's a video for you to watch on the project here. But seed banks are used, and they are now storing over 25% of all plant species, seeds of all plant species in the world. If the plant then goes extinct in the wild, or a disease wipes it out, we can wait for that disease to disappear after it's burned itself out, and then reintroduce that seed back into the wild. The benefit of seed banks in using seeds is you can produce high numbers of seeds stored in relatively small spaces. It can be stored anywhere in the world, and you can store seeds for a long period of time and then still germinate them later on to create healthy plants. The couple of issues with seed banks is the vitality of the seed does decrease over time, so you might have to regularly take that seed, germinate it into a plant, and then take new seeds from it if you want to keep it for a long time. Small seeds, as you'll see on the video, are easy to store, but bigger seeds and liquid containing seeds such as coconuts are not possible to do because you have to freeze these, and obviously water expands in seeds. Note there are animal seed banks as well, which use tissues, eggs and sperm to store genetic resources, so this has been used for animals as well as we move more into the future. There is Again, when we're looking at conservation, a species-based conservation approach is called CITES, and CITES stands for the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And basically CITES is a international agreement between countries that will enforce laws to prevent the trade of endangered species. And CITES, basically, if you were caught trying to trade species over international borders, you could face imprisonment for a very long time if it was a certain species that you can't take. So there are basically all organisms on the list are split into 3 different species groups. There's the Appendix 1, which is species that are threatened with extinction, and pretty much all trade on them is prohibited. Appendix 2 are species that might not necessarily be threatened with extinction currently, but they need to be monitored and supported to prevent that happening. And these species can be commercially traded, but it is controlled heavily, so you need licenses to make sure it's done in the most sustainable way possible. And then Appendix 3 is ones that have some sort of regulation in certain parts of the world and may need some control as a result. And the one thing you've been asked to look at is the Edge Existence Project and look at the 2 main criteria that it has. So the 2 criteria that this project has is, does the species have few or no close relatives? Would that make it a priority if it's therefore got what we call a small number of clades? And is the species in danger of extinction because all remaining populations are threatened? And they use this to identify which species to conserve as a result. So the final part of this then is looking at climate change. Obviously a big part of biodiversity and impacts on the planet. Often overlooked, so please don't do that, because this is a key area where you will be asked questions, as it's so important in today's biology. So before we introduce climate change, let's look at the difference between the term weather and climate. So the weather is a daily change of temperature or pressure and precipitation. It varies over a short distance, and it cannot predict long time into the future, and it can fluctuate widely. So for example, I live about 6 miles away from Bromsgrove, and when we've had a thunderstorm once at Bromsgrove, I rang home and my wife said there was no storm or anything there. So that is over a short distance, and the thunderstorm didn't last for ages, so it was a short amount of time. As soon as it finished, the sun came out. The climate, on the other hand, is a longer spread of time over a much larger geographical location. So you might say the climate of the whole planet, you might say the climate of the UK, you might say the climate of the Northern Hemisphere, okay, but it's a larger geographical location. We can predict the climate overall because we see trends in the way that it's moving, and it has slow changes, which makes that predictions quite easy. So even though in the UK the weather was unpredictable during July, it was, as a climate, the hottest month of July ever seen on planet Earth. Now, both of these things can be affected by certain things. So they can both be affected by the atmosphere and oceanic circulation. They can be affected by forest fires, by cloud coverage, by volcanic eruptions, and unfortunately due to human activity. So the long-term climate has constantly changing, and we know there are 2 major factors affecting the climate. If you think about it, why would the Earth possibly get warmer? Well, it's either due to fluctuations in solar emissions, or it's due to changing proportions of gases in the atmosphere, the greenhouse gases trapping the sun's heat in the atmosphere. And obviously humans are increasing this by our emission of carbon dioxide due to the burning of fossil fuels. So you could be asked to explain the greenhouse effect, and you might have a picture like this one, probably less right on it, or you may have nothing at all. So you should be able to explain the greenhouse effect. So let's have a look at that. So first of all, you need to know what are we doing that's causing it. It's not just carbon dioxide gas. We should really say it's all greenhouse gases, because the methane is 20 times more powerful, so that is an example of another greenhouse gas. So burning fossil fuels produces carbon dioxide gas. This is increasing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So imagine this here is getting more and more thicker, this line I'm adding on now, which is going to cause us an issue over time. The greenhouse gases allow ultraviolet light into the atmosphere, so this light here is ultraviolet. That can enter the atmosphere and it's absorbed by the Earth. The Earth then emits the energy as infrared radiation, which has a different wavelength. It has a longer wavelength to ultraviolet, and therefore it's going to have different properties. As a result, it can't escape the greenhouse layer, and some of the greenhouse gases absorb this heat, preventing it from being emitted out into space, and as a result this increases the mean global temperature of the planet. You could also talk about methane here instead of carbon dioxide, because methane again is the other main greenhouse gas. So currently the IPCC, which is the International Panel on Climate Change, stance is that warming of the climate system is unequivocal, with changes since 1950 being unprecedented. The main gases there have increased in the atmosphere more than in the last 800,000 years since 1950. Further emissions of greenhouse gases will cause more change, and we would have to reduce emissions substantially if that is going to be prevented. And human influence on climate is 95 to 100% chance the cause of climate warming since 1950. How do we know this? Well, we've used climate models. So we used models very early on, where it was very difficult using mathematical models to work out the changes since the 1950s, but more modern models with more modern computer power have allowed us to look at all different variables and how that can affect climate, and has allowed more higher predictions on climate change, much more so than in the past. And if you look at this graph, this shows you that the current carbon dioxide levels are hotter than any levels that we've seen, higher than any levels that we've previously seen, which does support the idea that as carbon dioxide levels are increasing, the global temperature is definitely increasing as well, because the global temperature is now breaking records. However, you can also see this level has never ever been this high before, so it's human activity is almost certainly increasing the carbon dioxide on the planet. But some people would argue that these peaks here, so if you look at this one in the past, now remember humans have not existed for all these peaks before, so this is long before humans were able to do industrialization, because that only really happened sort of here on the graph, that these peaks have had to be caused by something else, and therefore some people would argue that that peak may not be due to human activity. And this one you can see again shows the temperature of the planet lined up with carbon dioxide, and it shows there is a correlation between the two. It would show that our temperature has gone up more recently as the carbon dioxide has gone up, the temperature has gone up, and the carbon dioxide we know is being released from greenhouse emission, from burning fossil fuels. But again, skeptics would use this graph because humans were not burning fossil fuels at the previous peaks, and as a result this demonstrates that other factors could increase carbon dioxide levels dramatically on planet Earth. But when we look at carbon emissions, we can work out where our carbon emissions come from. So there's lots of different sources which we are aware emissions of carbon dioxide. Now, one thing which is being sort of looked at and worried about, I suppose, is how will climate change affect conditions on the planet? Is climate change part of a negative feedback loop or a positive feedback loop? So a negative feedback loop, negative feedback is the reversal of a change due to processes, and actually negative feedback means things are more stable. So if something changes, i.e. it gets more warmer, the Earth will work against it to cool down that change. However, obviously it could also be part of a positive feedback loop, which we'll come on to in a second. So here's an example of a negative feedback. So I'll just put a negative sign there in the middle there, and this one as a positive feedback sign over here for later on. So in negative feedback, we could start here. The global temperatures we know are rising. We know one of the impacts of that is the ice caps are melting. Those ice caps could provide more water in the atmosphere for evaporation, which would cause more clouds and more solar radiation. If the cloud coverage around planet Earth increased, more solar radiation would be reflected back out into space, which could in theory cause the global temperatures to drop. However, we could also have positive feedback, and positive feedback is when a change is further enhanced by a process or further developed by a process, so it creates more unstable conditions. So here we have this idea of what if the global temperatures rise. Well, that again could melt the ice caps, but then let's think about that. Underneath those ice caps there is dark soil. Dark things absorb more radiation, and therefore more solar radiation is absorbed, and then that causes a drop in albedo or reflection, and therefore you're absorbing more heat into the planet and it would get hotter. So if we've got negative feedback, positive feedback, global warming would increase and the warming up would speed up if positive feedback happened. So there's a couple of different examples of this which we're going to look at, which are potentially being seen now across the planet. So positive feedback, I said earlier, is when the end product in a result the end product results in amplification of the process. So an example where this may be seen is in the permafrost. So we know that methane is a very strong greenhouse gas that is about 20 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And currently the methane is locked away in parts of Siberia underneath the permafrost. So here we have permafrost example. Here we see some exposed permafrost, a layer of ice which is just under the ground, and therefore it keeps the ground constantly frozen. Below that layer of permafrost there is organic matter that cannot decay, and it might have been trapped there for thousands of years because the ice is preventing it from decaying. If that did decay, it would release tons of methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and as long as the ice is there, that won't happen. But if we go on to the circles, a global rise in temperatures has caused producing more greenhouse gases in the planet, is starting to cause the permafrost to thaw, so to melt. That then is leading to the organic matter that was previously frozen to start thawing, and as a result that organic matter is starting to be decayed, and obviously as that decays it releases much more carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. That then will continue in a positive feedback loop that will increase temperatures more, meaning more permafrost melts and more decay, leading to more methane being released. So here's another example of it to show you. High levels of greenhouse in the atmosphere cause temperature to increase. Increase in temperatures cause the permafrost to thaw. The thawing exposes previously frozen organic matter that starts to decay. As the organic matter decays, it releases methane and carbon dioxide, which goes into the atmosphere and further increases that initial warming. So it's causing it to melt. Decay can then happen. Methane is being released from the permafrost as the organic matter decays, and that is therefore accelerating the change of climate change. Another area where this has been seen is in the boreal forests. So boreal forests exist in colder climates. So in the UK, northern Scotland would be the only place we'd say is a boreal forest. Lower rates of respiration occur here because the temperature is so low. So enzyme work slowly. Decomposition is therefore a very slow process as a result. And when decomposition happens, it does release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But because this is slow, the levels of carbon dioxide are reduced. And therefore the plants normally absorb more photosynthesis more carbon dioxide via photosynthesis than is released. However, as the temperatures are increasing globally, the temperatures in these boreal forests are increasing. Therefore, respiration and decomposition is increasing. Both of those processes again releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Because they're both releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, what is starting to happen is they're starting to become carbon sources. You can add to this the fact there are more fires because the temperature of the planet is going up, and therefore boreal forests could cross a tipping point where they are carbon sources as opposed to carbon sinks in the future. So what's the immediate effects of this? Well, obviously there's lots of effects of climate change, weather patterns changing, etc. But the Arctic is going to be one of the first areas to see this climate change impacts, and the big impact is habitat loss due to the fact that they are an extreme environment that depends on the cold. So polar habitats are melting faster due to climate change. This can affect the annual melting, making it really unpredictable. Food sources may be affected on the ice, so you should be aware that the polar bears in the Arctic and penguins in the Antarctic use ice to feed from, to hunt from, and that can be an issue. Also use it to rest, so animals have to swim further before they can rest, and that's causing polar bears to be found that have drowned because they've swam nearly 100 miles and they haven't survived. And even for penguins, it can be breeding grounds as well. So that loss of Arctic ice and Antarctic ice is potentially going to have a big impact on the biodiversity in the poles. Now, when we get to the higher level, and the next little bit is just for higher level students, we need to look at phonology. And phonology means the timing of biological events. So it's the studying of timings of biological activities. So for example, most humans go to sleep in the night time. They might go to sleep at like 10 o'clock at night and get up at say 7 o'clock in the morning, and that's fine. If you ever have to have a job where you do night shifts, so if you become a doctor and you do night shifts, you will notice the night shifts really mess with your behaviour patterns and can really be quite difficult until you get used to it. And we're looking at things like that, changes of studying biological activity due to timings, and some timings are affected by things like temperature, and this could be evidence of climate change and show some of the impacts of climate change. Now, what I was talking about technically a few minutes ago is the photoperiod, which is the length of time an organism is exposed to light during 24 hours. And this is obviously varying during the year, but really important to remember, light levels are not impacted by climate change. So even as the temperature gets warmer, the light levels will stay the same. So photoperiodness is essential in flowering of plants. So plants need to open during the daylight. Some flowers will only develop when there's a certain amount of hours of daylight in the summer, for example. Loss of leaves in the autumn is controlled by the daylight hours, and migration in birds is linked to daylight hours, although it can also be linked to temperatures as well. So let's have a look at what are the impacts of climate change on biological activities. Well, birds will largely migrate on daylight hours, so they'll use photoperiod for that. So they know when to go. When the daylight hours change to a certain level, they will know to fly at that point. But climate could have an impact as well, because the other factor that they rely on is resource availability. So if they fly somewhere and there's no resources that year due to climate change, then at that point they might change the times of which they migrate. Insect populations, for example, might peak sooner, so climate change might make the insects peak sooner, but birds may still reproduce at the same time due to daylight hours. So if the birds, for example, reproduce at the end of spring, but the insects have become more active earlier in the spring, it might mean that there's a mismatch, which means that basically the consumer is not ready for the high abundance of prey. And this has been seen in Greenland caribou, which are declining, and one of the possibilities is they have a mismatch with their food. So they migrate in spring because of daylight hours, but the plants that they rely on during this migration are growing earlier in the year, and therefore the caribou are missing out on the main amount of plants. So when they start to move, the plants are already dying off as a result of climate change. Insects are rapidly changing as well. Insects have very short lifespans and they are often controlled by temperature, and some insects are having 2 life cycles now due to longer warm periods on the planet. Now you might think this is good for certain food supplies, and that would be true, but insects that are pests such as the Northern American bark beetle is making disease spread much more quicker. This carries a fungus, and that fungus attacks the spruce tree. So spruce trees are in particular danger now because these insects, which bred once a year until recently, are now breeding twice a year because of climate change. Climate stress on the trees also doesn't help, so the trees are getting 2 sort of ways being bombarded here by the disease carrying insects, but also a lack of water and heat lowers the plant's defences and makes it more susceptible as a result. So another thing that's been affected by climate change is the movement of water in currents around our world's oceans. So a current is the movement of the water vertically and horizontally on the surface and in deep water, and interchanging between the two. And it has a vital role on our planet in terms of distribution of energy, and it is key in understanding our energy change in the atmosphere as well. So it's really important. If the currents were to change, it would have a massive effect on us on the land. You can see it in the news at the minute because El Nino is happening, and all that is a change in wind direction across the Pacific Ocean, which can have massive effects around the world. There are deep water currents, which are 90% of the currents, and they often carry huge amounts of temperature around the globe. And the deep water mid-Atlantic current, which we're going to talk about later on, brings heat up to the UK, and this is why the UK is a lot warmer than other countries in the same latitude. So if you go to sort of Russia and places like this, it's a lot colder, and if we go that way, Canada is a lot colder than the UK. So this heat is vital to give the UK its relatively warm climate. So how do currents work? Well, basically salt and temperature are the 2 abiotic factors that affect this, because it affects the density and causes movements. So we say that the oceans are stratified. So what that means is we have generally 2 layers of water. We have warm, less salty water that floats on top, and underneath is cold, more salty water. And basically they work because warm water will hold less salt, okay, than cold water, so it's less dense and it rises. Cold water is more dense because it holds more salt and it will sink. And basically as the warm water rises, cold is drawn up from the depths to replace it in upwellings, and cold water which has risen is then replaced by warm water and sinks in downwellings. And the water will circulate between the cold deep and the warmer surface water. So what is happening is that some of the impacts of climate change are reducing the movement of water. And if water currents are reduced, there'll be less movements between the strata at the top, the warm, less salty water, and the cold, salty water below. And this means the ocean becomes stable, but not like a stable ecosystem, what we're saying. It means it's not mixing, so that is a bad thing. So warmer water, why is this happening? Well, the water is getting warmer, and therefore this is meaning it's getting warmer and warmer water due to the warmer atmosphere. Warmer water is going to then cause positive feedback as a result. So the process is going to, the product of warm water itself is going to increase the amount of climate change on the planet, because by having warmer water, less carbon dioxide can actually be absorbed into the water. That means there's an increased global temperature because less carbon dioxide is being absorbed, stays in the atmosphere, and therefore you get more global temperature, which will again further increase the water warming as well. Also, warmer water can hold less oxygen, so this is a problem, meaning less oxygen is available for respiration in marine organisms, and warmer water can also lead to coral bleaching, which is when the algae leaves or abandons the coral because it's too warm as a result. So there you can see how climate change can have a positive feedback effect on the atmosphere as well. And one of the last things I just want to mention here is this is worrying for the UK, because this northern Atlantic current, as you see here, is effectively potentially going to be affected by this, because, and there are already signs it might be slowing, because the ice cap's melting in Greenland. It's adding so much fresh water in, it's diluting the saltiness, and it is stopping water sinking down. This therefore is then meaning less water is returning to the Gulf of Mexico, and less warm water is being dragged up towards the UK. So we don't really study it massively, but we do need to know about some potential mitigation strategies. What can we do to reduce the impacts of climate change? Well, we can obviously, hopefully, reduce or stabilise the greenhouse gas emissions. So things like using electric cars instead of diesel and petrol, renewable energy such as wind and solar energies, as opposed to burning fossil fuels. And we are making leaps and bounds in those areas. But that's probably not going to be enough. So we can also remove carbon dioxide from our atmosphere. And there are natural ways to do that, which is obviously what we call aforestation, which is planting trees, increasing the rate of carbon dioxide absorption via photosynthesis. But there might be artificial ways using technology to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as well. There's something called carbon capture, which you'll have seen in the news. And then there's also something called geoengineering, and this is the idea of maybe creating an algal bloom in the sea, so like eutrophication, which would then absorb lots of carbon dioxide, and then creating the algae so it would sink to the bottom of the ocean and trap it at the bottom of the ocean. So mitigation is that idea of how we can reduce the impact, reduce the actual carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that idea of technology or enhancing our current carbon sinks, such as planting more trees, is essential. So for biology, this really leads to the term aforestation, for carbon sequestration. So aforestation is when we plant more trees. So as opposed to deforestation, we are planting the trees now, and we know plants are carbon sinks. They fix carbon dioxide into glucose. So the governments around the world are trying to invest in aforestation, planting new forests and reforesting the areas. There are going to be many benefits for this in terms of health, biodiversity, but also obviously if we can absorb those carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but store it away for a long time, that will massively help. And you can see here on the tree lots of different reasons why aforestation is essential. So we have cleaning the air, which is obviously one, we want to get rid of that carbon dioxide. We've got mitigation of flooding, because trees absorb lots of water, habitats for wildlife, carbon sinks, preventing soil erosion, transpiration increases, UV shields. So there's lots of benefits for why we should do aforestation, but the main one being it increases the amount of photosynthesis on the planet, which absorbs carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and fixes it into glucose.